Ukraine is unexpectedly stepping up negotiations with the Russians to end the war. President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine shocked many today. He stated that as soon as tomorrow, November 19th, he will urgently travel to Turkey, where, by the way, the Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, Rustem Umerov, is already present in order to achieve the resumption of peace talks with Russia. And here's an interesting fact for you right away. Umerov was in the United States of America the day before, where, by a strange coincidence before that, Putin's representative Kirill Dmitriev had held talks with Trump's representative Vitkov. But what's even more telling is that Zelensky announced in connection with this visit that this week he plans to meet with officials and deputies from the ruling Servant of the People Party, and also announced some fundamental decisions necessary for the country. And these decisions concern a new legislative framework, which may be related to those very peace negotiations. And the very next day after the talks in Turkey, Zelensky already announced a meeting of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief's staff. Interestingly, some media outlets are already claiming that some high-ranking Russian official might be present at the talks in Turkey. But today the Kremlin has already stated that their representative will not be at the talks, but they will be waiting for details. And here, as they say, the puzzle comes together. Putin's envoy Kirill Dmitriev stated the day before that he had been negotiating with Steve Vitkov, supposedly about the release of Americans from Russian prisons. But now that very same Steve Vitkov is urgently flying to Turkey to meet with Zelensky, and Rustem Umerov, who has been visiting several countries all this time, says that he was actually preparing the ground for an attempt to resume negotiations with the Russians. My name is Pechiy. Let's discuss this topic in detail together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, like this video, write a like, leave your comment under the episode, and also subscribe to my Telegram channel Pechiy News. The link to it is in the description of this video. There we publish breaking news as it comes in. And if you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so with any donation using the links and details in the description of this video. President Volodymyr Zelensky said today he plans to meet this week with officials and deputies from the Servant of the People Party, and also announced the Prime Minister. This is a crucial decision for the country, and the statement surprised many people. But to understand what's going on, as they say, you need to put together all the pieces of this story. And Rustem Umerov, the Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, seems to play one of the key roles here. Zelensky today writes, quote, "On Thursday he instructed to prepare the Supreme Commander-in-Chief's headquarters. This week there will be discussions with officials and a meeting with Verkhovna Rada leaders and Servant of the People deputies. I am preparing several necessary legislative initiatives and fundamental swift decisions that our country needs." Interestingly, the president did not specify which area the decision will impact, and that's when speculation started to appear accordingly. Some say that it's about the complete dissolution of the cabinet of ministers after the Mindichgate scandal. Others say that a huge split was brewing within the Servant of the People Party itself, because Bankova had been assuring its deputies for a long time that there were supposedly no Mindich recordings, but it turned out they were simply being lied to. Some Servant of the People deputies are upset with Zelensky, Yermak, and the presidential office for leading them by the nose. But even more telling was another message from Zelensky, which at least clarifies part of the situation. Zelensky announced a visit to Turkey with the aim of stepping up negotiations with Russia. Quote, "Meetings will be held in Turkey tomorrow, Wednesday, November 19th. We are preparing to step up negotiations, and we have a developed solution that we will offer to our partners. Bringing the end of the war closer by all means is Ukraine's top priority. We are also working to resume exchanges and the return of prisoners." Here's the first point I want to highlight. What proposals does Zelensky plan to bring to these negotiations? The fact is that back in October, in the context of preparations for the Trump-Putin meeting in Budapest, Ukraine and the European Union prepared their own 12-point peace plan. We have already talked about it with you on this channel, but to put it briefly, this plan includes the following points. The first point is, of course, Russia's agreement to an unconditional ceasefire. After that, the plan includes the following points: exchange of prisoners, the return by Russia of abducted Ukrainian children, negotiations between Moscow and Kiev on the administration of occupied territories, Europe and Ukraine refusing to legally recognize territorial concessions, security guarantees for Ukraine from the West, Ukraine's accession to the European Union, financial support for the restoration of Ukraine's economy, and the gradual lifting of sanctions against Russia. However, the unfreezing of Russian assets is only expected if Moscow participates in the restoration of Ukraine's economy and pays reparations. Next is the creation of a peace council chaired by President Donald Trump to oversee the implementation of the plan. This is very similar to Steve Witkov's approach. He once developed a similar plan for the Gaza Strip. As you know, there is also a peace council there, chaired by Donald Trump, which is currently overseeing how the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas militants will be maintained. And when this plan was presented to the White House, no meeting between Trump and Putin was being planned anymore. In addition, note that Volodymyr Zelensky has recently been touring Europe to secure support for Ukraine amid Russian strikes on the Ukrainian energy system and a corruption scandal that has engulfed the country. Today, Zelensky is meeting with the Prime Minister of Spain, Sanchez. Yesterday, he met with the President of France, Macron. So now, with their support, he can discuss Europe's peace plan with American and Turkish representatives. Let's move on. Shortly after Zelensky's statement, it became known that United States Special Representative Steve Witkoff would visit Turkey on November 19th and take part in the planned negotiations there with Volodymyr Zelensky. The president of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, will also be present there. And later, media reports appeared stating that some high-ranking Russian official would be present at the negotiations. Zelensky, his delegation plus Turkish, American and Russian delegations are expected to attend. But Vladimir Putin's press secretary Dmitry Peskov said that the Russian side had not received any information from Kiev. He also said that there would be no Russian representatives at the talks in Turkey, where the issue of resuming dialogue between Moscow and Kyiv will be discussed. However, Russia is waiting for the outcome. Next, I'll quote Peskov. Apparently, Zelensky meant the contacts that will take place tomorrow in Istanbul. These are Zelensky's contacts with our Turkish friends, which Mr. Witkoff will probably join. We will await the negotiation results. If any of the mentioned individuals considers it necessary to inform the Russian side, of course, President Putin will be open to a conversation. Well, it turns out that the meeting with the Russians is off. Well, at least that's how it looks, but that's not quite the case. And here, the Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, Rustem Umerov, steps to the forefront. Back on November 16, it was announced in Kyiv that indirect negotiations on a prisoner exchange with Russia were once again underway. A separate episode about the resumption of negotiations was released on my YouTube channel. Many people started accusing me of lying and saying things weren't that way, so listen closely to what's next. The Secretary of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, Rustem Umerov, said this concerns restarting exchanges under the Istanbul agreements. Turkey and the United Arab Emirates acted as mediators in the discussions about resuming the exchange. But this is just the beginning. In Ukraine, conspiracy theories are already circulating that Umerov has fled the country. After all, on November 11, amid evidence that the Mindich Gate case is investigating Timur Mindich's influence on the country's defense sector, there are claims that the Ministry of Defense is also involved. Former Minister of Defense and current National Security and Defense Council Secretary Rustem Umerov made an urgent business trip to Turkey. Well, that is on that very day. But then in the coordination headquarters, which handles the exchange processes, for some reason they learned about Umerov's trip from the media and said that they didn't know he went specifically to negotiate the exchange of prisoners of war. But suddenly, on November 16, Rustem Umerov flies to Florida in the United States, and this is where things get really interesting. On one hand, it could be assumed that Rustem Umerov went to Florida because his whole family lives there. Well, he decided to visit his family. Since he was already abroad, he decided to visit his family in America. But the thing is, it's in Miami, Florida, where Steve Witkoff, Donald Trump's representative, often holds meetings. Remember this moment, Umerov is in Florida. Today, the National Security and Defense Council announced that Umerov is on a scheduled overseas business trip, which lasts from November 11 to 19 inclusive. The itinerary includes Turkey, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and the United States. It was stated that Umerov met with many politicians from Turkey, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. But for some reason, there wasn't a single word about meetings in the United States of America, although he was there on November 16, and later it became clear why there wasn't much information about it. The National Security and Defense Council hasn't commented on Umerov's activities in America. Today we have a special report. The representative of the Russian president, Kirill Dmitriev, stated that Russia and the United States discussed the possibility of conducting another prisoner exchange. Dmitriev said the exchange was discussed during his late October visit to the United States. And according to the publication Axios, the discussions at that time involved the special representative of the American president, Steve Witkoff, and other administration staff. And where did the meeting take place? In that very Florida, because Witkoff often invites his counterparts there. So, according to the reports, the negotiations went well, but no agreements were reached at that time. And here's an interesting point for you. At that time, the meeting between Dmitriev and Witkoff took place in Florida because Witkoff often holds meetings there, specifically in Miami. It was in Florida that Umerov was on November 16th, and now Witkoff, who previously held negotiations there with Dmitriev, is flying to Turkey to meet with Zelensky. No one has yet announced whether Umerov met with Witkoff in Florida or not, but it's an interesting coincidence. So, it's not really surprising that tomorrow Russians might actually not be present at the negotiations in Turkey. The negotiations will take place without them. Witkoff has basically proven that he is very good at conveying the Russian position. We can only guess what urgent legislative initiatives President Zelensky is preparing and why he needs an emergency meeting. The stakes of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief the day after the negotiations in Turkey. And finally, I'll add one more very interesting detail that's definitely worth thinking about. Reuters reports that an unnamed American official emphasized yesterday that the United States President's administration is definitely continuing negotiations with the Russians about ending the war in Ukraine. However, preparations for the dialogue did not become the focus of the news because of the large number of events. They just haven't made any public statements about it. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.